Hi, and welcome to your module on diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is Dr. Nafisa Jalal, and I'm excited to go through this learning journey with you. Let's take a glance at our table of contents. We'll start with definitions on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and why they matter to you as opticians. We'll look at Ontario's changing demographics. We'll discuss gender identification, pronouns, terms such as binary, non-binary, and others. We'll define bias and unconscious bias, and power and privilege. We'll look at cultural competence and humility. We'll go through some case studies and best practices for each scenario. And finally, we'll end with some broader DEI best practices. Lots to cover, so let's get started. We begin with defining and understanding three very important terms: diversity, equity, and inclusion. The acronym DEI is commonly used. Most basically put, diversity refers to differences among people. Every person has attributes which are different from your own and from groups that you belong to. We already know that each individual is unique, and diversity encourages us to recognize those individual differences. It also reminds us that individuals affiliate with multiple identities. All of us have many aspects of diversity that define us, and we usually belong to more than just one group. Now, what aspect of diversity comes to mind for you right away? If I were to ask you to write down the one difference that is most noticeable to you in other people, what would it be? Well, research shows that in North America, race is what most people answered. In any discussion on diversity, race has shown to be front and center. Today, I'd like to invite us to think about some other aspects of diversity beyond race. Ethnicity, gender. What about a person's sexual orientation? Socioeconomic status? Surely our financial place in society, our haves and have-nots, influence who we are. Our age? Perhaps our physical and mental abilities? Some other common ones are geography. Where in the country we live, whether it be rural or urban, influences who we are. What about our marital status and also our parental status? Our political beliefs certainly diversify us. Religion, whether we practice a faith or not, and if yes, which faith we practice defines our realities in many ways. Immigration status, are we a newcomer to Canada? Have we lived here for generations? All of these things, and this list is certainly not exhaustive, makes us diverse. Diversity is both invisible and visible. In fact, 90% of diversity is invisible, meaning they are attributes that we cannot see and may not know about until and unless we dig deeper. This iceberg is submerged to show some invisible aspects. Not all physical or mental abilities are visible. Many people around us have cognitive challenges that we do not even know exist. A person's religion, values, and life experiences can often not be guessed just by looking at them. Neither can their age or sexual orientation. And yet, all of these things are extremely important and make up who a person is and what their needs may be when accessing healthcare services. Hence, I encourage you all to give the invisible aspects of diversity as much importance as the visible aspects, and certainly always to think beyond race when you think about diversity. Moving on to equity, it is the fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people. While they sound similar, it is very different from equality, which aims to give everyone the same, regardless of their individual circumstances and challenges. Because we do not all begin on an even playing field in life, we each have our own unique challenges and our unique journeys that have brought us to where we are today. Hence, our needs are also not the same. This visual explains equity quite clearly, I find. You see a set of examples, all of different sizes, and the individual feeding them saying everyone should get an equal amount of food in order to be fair. Certainly, you may agree that the bigger animals here will need more food than the smaller ones in order to be equally full. This is another example that I like to use. The first image shows what equality looks like. Each of the three people have the same sized box to stand on in order to watch the game. As you can see, the third person cannot see anything because the one box does not provide enough height. The second image shows what equity looks like. The tallest person not needing a box at all, and the shortest one needing two boxes in order for them all to be able to watch the game. So why is diversity and equity important to you as opticians? Because you are serving patients coming from very diverse backgrounds. And please keep in mind the many aspects of diversity, not only race. So you need to adjust your approaches and services in order to meet their needs effectively. Just as with eyeglasses, one size does not fit all. Next, let's move on to inclusion. Inclusion is the act of creating environments in which any individual or group can feel and be welcomed, respected, supported, and valued to fully participate. An inclusive and welcoming climate embraces, not just accepts because they feel they have to, but rather embraces differences and offers respect in words and actions for all people. Please keep in mind that words, whether it be for your policies, your programs, your intentions, must translate into concrete actions in order for people to feel truly inclusive. Remember that you are an important part of the eye care team and a part of the bigger healthcare sector. Hence, an inclusive environment matters to you because your services are meant to be patient-centric. And it is essential that all segments of Ontario's diverse population feel comfortable in reaching out for your services and, of course, comfortable during their visit with you. Next, let us look at Ontario's changing demographics. Certainly, the province has changed drastically over the past few decades. So what does Ontario look and sound like now? The last set of official census data we have in Canada are from 2016. And diversity has increased, not decreased, in most categories in the past years. So let's glance at the numbers that we do have available, while keeping in mind that the trend for the years ahead show increasing diversity within our province. About 250 ethnic origins were reported by Ontarians. Here, let us think about cultural diversity. With more than 13 million residents speaking 200 languages, Ontario has the most culturally diverse population in Canada. Let us think about linguistic diversity here. It is home to the largest population of Indigenous people in the country. When we think about equity, let us think about whether our Indigenous populations are provided with the same opportunities, access, and quality of services as our non-Indigenous population. 1 in 7 Ontarians has a disability. Remember that some disabilities are visible, while many others are invisible. By 2020, the year that I'm recording this module, millennials will make up half of the global workforce. Let us think about diversity in age here, and whether that may influence what your patients will look like in the years to come. This pie chart gives us a glance at Ontario's racial diversity. As you can see, we live in an incredibly diverse province, with the South Asian population being the largest, followed by the Chinese and the Black populations. 48% of Ontario's population will be racialized by 2036. That is almost half of the province's population and only 16 years away from the time that I'm recording this. Why is it important for us to learn about demographic changes? because as Ontario continues to grow and change, opticians and all healthcare professionals must strive to accommodate the needs of the population, your patients. You need to provide services in a manner which is linguistically, culturally, and religiously appropriate. As opticians, you may need to even examine your policies, practices, and systems to see if they are inclusive of the populations you are serving or those that you're hoping to serve. You may need to use data available to take concrete, measurable actions that will hopefully reduce systemic barriers and eliminate discrimination and any possible harassment for your patients, as well as for you and your colleagues. Keep in mind that changing demographics do not only apply to your patients. There is just as much change among the profession itself. You, your optician colleagues, and all health sector professionals in the province belong to as many diverse groups as do your patients. Hence, when you think about DEI, know that looking through a DEI lens will benefit everyone. Let's move on to gender identification. What does it mean? Why is it important for us to know about this? It refers to a person's innermost concept of self. Do they think of themselves as male or female, or a blend of both, or perhaps neither? So gender identification is how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. It is important to note that a person's gender identity can be the same or different from their sex assigned at birth. So you may have been born a certain sex biologically, for example, a female, but can still consider yourself a different gender, for example, a male. Gendered pronouns, what are they? In the past, resources on gender-inclusive language mainly focused on incorporating women into general language because that was often missing. So for example, using he or she, or just even she, as the pronoun for a general subject, rather than always defaulting to he. Now the conversation on gender-inclusive language has expanded further to include people whose genders are neither male nor female. For example, people who are gender nonconforming, gender neutral, gender fluid, gender queer, or non-binary individuals, although this list is not exhaustive. The use of gender pronouns has become more visible in the last decade or two because many societies have realized that he and she are not sufficient to describe the genders of all people, because not all people are either male or female. Hence, the phrase he or she does not cover the full range of persons. The most common pronouns are they, them, theirs, she, her, hers, and he, him, his. Because in the English language we currently do not have a gender-neutral third-person singular personal pronoun, in recent years the use of the term they has gained considerable traction. So in your communications, you may want to use they to represent those who are not male or female. Transgender is a popular gender identification that some of you may be familiar with. This is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and/or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the sex they were assigned at birth. For example, as we noted earlier, someone may be born female, sex assigned at birth, but identifies as male. In that case, they may act in ways that males in our society would. To note, though, being transgender does not imply any specific sexual orientation. Therefore, transgender people may identify as straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and so forth. Another term you may often hear is queer. This is used interchangeably with LGBTQ. LGBTQ is an acronym people used to express fluid identities and orientations. The acronym stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or questioning. Each of these individual terms are used to describe a person's sexual orientation or their gender identity. I wanted to share an example with you of a place I visited a few years ago. Visionary Eye Care is LGBT owned and has been serving the community for 24 years in its Chicago location in the US. When they first opened their doors, they decided to advertise in the gay papers because they wanted to let that population know that they would be welcomed here. The slogan they used was 50% gay owned, 100% gay friendly. To read a quote from one of the owners, "It's been super important to be inclusive of the LGBTQ community. Being able to be out in a practice seems like the norm now, but 20 years ago, it wasn't. I worked for places that wanted me to tone down the gay. I believe that being out at work and working with the LGBTQ community makes me a more happy, concerned, and fulfilled healthcare professional." The message to take home from this example is that as opticians, you will do your best work when you can fully and openly be yourselves, and your patients will be most comfortable interacting with you and accessing your services when they also can fully and openly be themselves. Next, we move on to the terms binary and non-binary. You can remember what binary means if you know that bi means two. Black and white are often set up as a binary, as are light and dark and good and evil. One binary we see all the time is the male and female symbols you see on washroom doors, although in recent years, many organizations have moved to gender-neutral washrooms. So binary, in the DEI context, refers to the classification of gender into two distinct opposite forms of masculine and feminine, whether by cultural belief or social system of what we think masculine and feminine means. Non-binary, then, is the opposite of binary. It is an adjective describing a person who does not identify exclusively as a man or a woman. Non-binary people may identify as being both a man and a woman, somewhere in between, or as falling completely outside these categories. Some non-binary people may self-identify as transgender, although not all will. Why is understanding identity important for you as opticians? For the very reason that in order to be inclusive of all of your patients, you need to know who your patients are and how you can make them feel respected and comfortable. A person's gender identity is a fundamental part of who they are. Our individual gender identities are a source of our diversity, visible in some cases and invisible in others. If you value diversity, you need to understand various gender identities. And if you want to provide equitable services, you need to know what the needs of different gendered groups are. We have established that we don't live in a society where all your patients and colleagues, and perhaps even you yourself, will self-identify as male or female. Hence, it's important that you align the language you use in your practice to be reflective and respectful of those you are interacting with or serving. Organizations and professionals all across the country who value DEI are already making changes to how they do business. An example that some of us may be familiar with is that of Air Canada. In October of 2019, they decided they would no longer be using "ladies and gentlemen" by their flight attendants on their flights. The airline dropped that phrase in favor of the gender-neutral "everyone." "Welcome aboard, ladies and gentlemen" is now replaced with "Welcome aboard, everyone." Inclusive language, then, is language that is free from words, phrases, or tones that reflect prejudiced, stereotyped, or discriminatory views of particular people or even groups. At all times, I remind you that words are very powerful, so please be mindful with the language that you are using. Let us talk about bias, unconscious bias, power, and privilege next. By definition, bias is the action of supporting or opposing a particular person or thing in an unfair way because of allowing personal judgments to influence your judgment. For example, sentences such as reporters must be impartial and not show political bias, or there was clear evidence of a strong bias towards that employee. What is important to realize about bias is that we all have them. In fact, research suggests that it is hardwired into human cognition. They can be innate or they can be learned, and people may develop biases for or against an individual, a group, or a belief at any point in their life. Unconscious bias is simply the bias that a person is not aware that they have. It is often defined as prejudice or unsupported judgments in favor of or against one thing, person, or group as compared to another, in a way that is usually considered unfair. Many researchers suggest that unconscious bias occurs automatically as the brain makes quick judgments on past experiences and backgrounds. So we may not always realize it in that very moment when we make that judgment call, or sometimes even when we act on that judgment call, when we are unconsciously biased about something or someone. And that can lead to problematic situations. So how do we address biases that we may not even know we have? Well, as with any change in behavior, self-awareness and acceptance is critical. You can pay very close attention to the feelings that come up for you in relation to people that you interact with. Be honest with yourself, since change usually comes from a place of self-awareness. The more aware you are about the types of hidden bias you may hold, the more you will begin to overcome them. So the starting point will be to identify what your biases are. Once you have identified them, be willing to confront these patterns in your interactions. One best practice coming from a firm specializing in unconscious bias suggests taking a pause, P-A-U-S-E, to check one's reaction with each letter standing for an action. P suggests that you pay attention to what is happening beneath the surface. A suggests you acknowledge your own reactions, interpretations, and judgments. U suggests that you understand the other person's possible reactions, interpretations, and judgments. S suggests that you search for the most empowering, productive way forward. And finally, E suggests that you execute on the plan, whatever your plan may be. So I encourage you to try this and see if you are able to identify some biases that perhaps you were previously not conscious of. Next, let us move on to power and privilege. In simplest terms, power is the ability and having the authority to decide what is best for others. It is the ability to decide who will have access to resources and also the capacity to exercise control over others. Privilege, also in simple terms, is a special right or advantage that a person or group has. It can entail giving advantages, favors, and benefits to members of a dominant group at the expense of members of a minority group. Privilege can operate on several levels: personal, interpersonal, cultural, and institutional levels. Who has privilege? It's fair to say that some groups in society carry more privilege than others. In North America, people in one or more of the following social identity groups tend to carry more privilege: white or Caucasian people, often of European descent, those who are able-bodied, heterosexuals, males, middle to upper class people, middle-aged people versus the youth or the elderly, and English-speaking people, specifically those who speak the language fluently and without pronounced accents. Why are we talking about power and privilege today? You may feel it on some days more than others, but on all days, your profession as opticians, as a member of the healthcare sector, puts you in a position of both power and privilege. You are in a place to assist individuals with their eye care needs. Patients put their trust in you. Now, the process of becoming comfortable and open to acknowledging, critiquing, and accepting your own privilege often requires conscious effort. And what is especially important is that you do not abuse your power and privilege while serving patients. On that note, I encourage you to check your biases regularly so that any unconscious biases you have, given that you are in a position of power, do not influence your interactions with your patients. Next, let us look at cultural competence and cultural humility. What do these terms mean and why are they important to us? By definition, cultural competence is the ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures. It includes 5 key elements: cultural awareness, cultural knowledge, cultural skill, cultural encounters, and cultural desire. Being aware of one's own worldview is very important, as is developing positive attitudes towards other people's cultures and differences you may have. Gaining knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews allows you to be culturally competent. And developing skills for communication and interaction across cultures is extremely important, especially given the culturally diverse province you live and practice in. Relationship building. Why is this important to cultural competence? Because it is based on the foundations of understanding each other's expectations and attitudes. Whenever possible, I encourage you to build a relationship with your patients so that you can understand their needs and their preferences better. A reminder, however, that as an optician or healthcare provider, you need to balance this with maintaining professional boundaries, ensuring that you are asking appropriate questions, engaging in appropriate conversations, ensuring that these are pertinent to the clinical interaction, and making sure to never create a situation where a patient feels uncomfortable. Also keep in mind that just as culture is always changing, cultural competence is also not static. Our level of cultural competence changes in response to new situations, experiences, and relationships. So we have to remain open and adaptable to learning new things always. Most people are familiar with the concept of being humble. To be humble is to demonstrate humility. The National Institutes of Health, NIH, defines cultural humility as a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, whereby the individual not only learns about another's culture, but one starts examining with beliefs and cultural identities belonging to their own culture. So in contrast to the idea of cultural competence, cultural humility is never mastered. It is an ongoing process shaped by every encounter we have with every person, as long as we are open to learning. The literature on humility shares that a person cannot begin to understand the makeup and context of another person's life without being aware and reflective of their own background and situation first. As opticians serving diverse populations, who of course want to limit unconscious bias in their practice, it is essential for you to be culturally competent and to practice cultural humility so that you are constantly reflecting both inward and also absorbing learning from cultures around you. Let us now look at a few case studies of scenarios that you or your colleagues may have encountered and discuss some ways of approaching them. The first one is on pronouncing unfamiliar names. You are calling patients to let them know their eyeglasses are ready for pickup. You come across a name which is difficult to pronounce. What do? This also applies to someone who has physically come in. You look at their file and find that you are unsure of how to pronounce the name. Same question, what do you do? Note that living in Ontario, an extremely diverse province as we've established, it is likely that you will come across names that you have not previously encountered. Most, if not all of us will. First of all, be humble. Admit when you're having difficulty with a name. Many people with unique names know it, so they're unlikely to get less offended if you simply ask them how to pronounce it. With that said, an uncommon name to you may be very common to someone else, so make sure you are approaching this correctly. That means you don't start with, "I've never seen this name before," or, "Whoa, not even going to try to say your name." I've heard this before, and perhaps many of you have as well. Instead, you can start with something proactive, such as, "I apologize in advance if I'm mispronouncing your name. Is it?" And then give it a try. And after that, ask, "Did I get that right?" Or you can try, "I want to make sure I get your name right. How do you say it?" Or, "Can you tell me how to properly pronounce your name?" Or, "Would you mind saying your name again? I missed it the first time because I was distracted by," and then mention what you were distracted by. "Sorry, do you mind repeating your name?" It is less likely that someone will feel offended if they know you're trying to get it right and trying not to be rude. So instead of attempting something that you are unsure about, respectfully ask and then repeat it correctly. I also encourage all of you to be active bystanders. When you see and hear someone mispronounce another person's name, take the initiative and correct them. So far, this has happened to me once, and I'll never forget it. When a colleague corrected somebody else's mispronunciation of my name, it took the burden off of me to have that conversation. The next scenario touches on socioeconomic diversity. Your store offers free sight testing with the purchase of contact lens or eyewear. A patient informs you that they have a strict $75 budget to spend on eyewear. You continually recommend higher priced eyewear because you believe it is better quality. You explain to the patient that in the long run they will spend less money as the more expensive frames are less likely to break. You tell them that they should spend the extra $100 now. The patient is hesitant, but ends up purchasing the higher priced eyewear because they believe that you, their eye health professional, recommended the particular eyewear with their best interest only in mind. Their trust in you as a professional led them to make a purchase that they could necessarily not afford. There can, of course, be advantages to offering high-end products. However, the patient has outlined a financial limitation to you. It is your job as an eye care professional to work within these parameters in order to provide the best possible care. Not all your clients are in the same socioeconomic position. Some may be on government programs such as ODSP and Ontario Works, who subsidize lenses. At all times with every patient, you must accommodate their financial limitations while still treating them with the same dignity and importance as a patient with less financial constraints. If you want to promote higher end products for the sake of your business, then you need to highlight the different options within the budget. Provide the patient with the information. Outline the advantages and disadvantages of each product. Basically, you should help the patient arrive at their own decision based on all the possible options presented to them. Yes, it may be important to balance business and health in a manner that is beneficial to the both of you, but at all times, remember that the needs of your patients must be prioritized. Next, let us talk about balancing professional boundaries with cultural norms. Rekha and David are registered opticians who share a practice. She has moved from India 10 years ago while he was born in Ontario. David has noticed that when certain patients, also of Indian background, come in, Rekha's visits with them are much longer, she is chattier, and she shares her personal problems with them. One patient in particular, Reena, is someone Rekha has become very close to. Keep in mind that they live in a small community where everyone is familiar with each other. Now, David has spoken to his partner Rekha about this not being professional behavior. She, however, responded by saying that she feels comfortable being conversational with people who share her cultural background, particularly because building relationships with patients was normal in her practice in India. So she personally sees nothing unprofessional about it. Here, it's important to remember that just as our patients come from all over the world, so do we as opticians. Hence, naturally, we will bring our past experiences with us, especially those that we found favorable. However, crossing a boundary once can become a habit, as once a relationship has changed into a more personal connection, it is hard to then withhold information from them. In this case, over time, Reena becomes invested in Rekha's problems. But let's remember that Reena's role isn't to console Rekha, it is to be her patient. Rekha's role, on the other hand, is to provide Reena's vision care. While a role reversal where Reena is serving Rekha's needs to vent to receive support can definitely happen by accident, it certainly does need to be addressed. It is fine for them to have these conversations outside of the work environment. But while Reena is Rekha's patient, Rekha must work to keep the conversation professional in order to ensure objective and trustworthy care, regardless of expressed cultural norms. So set the tone of the discussion and ensure that the topics are concerned with patient needs and eye care rather than your personal needs. And if you find yourself building a personal relationship with a patient rather than keeping it to a professional one, please reevaluate and focus on re-establishing boundaries. Most people are social creatures, and it is normal for us to connect with others, especially those whom we see commonalities with. However, while we must always respect the cultural diversity that our colleagues bring, this case is meant to emphasize that personal etiquette in providing care needs to come first, professional etiquette rather, at all times. Next, let us talk about systemic racism. We know from generations of testimonies of Indigenous and racialized people accessing healthcare that racism, discrimination, and violence toward them is prevalent and often results in traumatizing experiences and receiving improper care. Sadly, opticianry is not exempt from this. Quotes like the ones here are commonly heard from an Indigenous person. I haven't seen a vision provider in a long time because of cultural safety issues. I don't have trust for opticians. From a Black individual, my son broke my glasses, so I needed to go get a prescription so I could buy a pair of glasses. I get there and the optometrist was talking to me as if I was 10 years old. As we were talking, they were saying, "What do you do?" And as soon as they found out what I did professionally, the whole attitude of this person changed towards me. I don't know if they come in there thinking, "Oh, this poor Black man does not have a clue." I definitely felt like I was being treated differently. A quote from this Indigenous woman: "I would not recommend this place to anyone. I have been dealing with buying glasses for 23 years. I have been disrespected and mistreated many times, but never as much as this. The owner didn't think we would be spending enough money at his store, and as a result, his rudeness escalated to the point that he literally kicked us out of the store. I cannot attest to the product the store has to offer, but I can say that the customer service is horrific. I will never go there again and seriously warn anyone from going there." Very often, we do not intentionally mean to come off as biased and stereotyping people, especially our patients. However, reality shows that we continuously do it. So what are some things we can do to deter this behavior? We can try stereotype replacement. which is first recognizing that our response is based on stereotype and then consciously adjusting that response. So actively thinking about what we will say before we say it. We can try counter-stereotypic imaging, which is imagining the individual as the opposite of the stereotype. So if you normally would think of an indigenous person or a person of color as someone who is less educated or less informed, then train yourself to think the opposite. Think that they will understand exactly what you are saying and speak to them at that level. We can try individuation, which is seeing the person as an individual rather than a stereotype. So learning about their personal history and the context that brought them to your practice. Knowing who your patients are is always important. We can try perspective taking, which is putting yourself in the other person's shoes. Research has consistently shown that this is important in terms of showcasing empathy and being relatable. Or we can try partnership building, which means reframing the interaction with the patient as one between collaborating equals, rather than between a high status person, you, and a low status person, your patient. Regardless of which ones you choose to use, please ensure that you are actively doing your part to eliminate systemic racism from our healthcare field. Next, let us look at cultural norms and effective eye care. You are sitting across a patient discussing lens options and which would best suit their visual needs. You realize the patient is avoiding eye contact with you. How do you navigate the situation? It is important for the effective clinical care, but there may be circumstances for the patient that are contributing to the avoiding of eye care. In many cultures, including Hispanic, Asian, Middle Eastern, and Indigenous, eye contact is thought to be disrespectful, rude, and aggressive. And lack of eye contact does not mean that a person is not paying attention. Many cultures and people who belong to certain religions consider eye contact between men and women inappropriate, either as threatening or even flirtatious. And in many Asian cultures, avoiding eye contact with a member of the opposite sex or a superior is actually seen as a show of respect. These results suggest to us that cultural differences in eye contact behavior emerge from differential display rules and, of course, different cultural norms. Balancing care and being culturally accommodating can require some sensitivity. Be aware that some people have cultural challenges that make it difficult to make direct eye contact simply because it is not something they're accustomed to. In many cases, they may not even realize that they are not making eye contact with you until or unless you say something about it. Others may be living with social anxiety disorders or autism or Asperger's syndrome. If someone is seeming unwilling or unable to meet your gaze, be patient. Explain to your patient that you understand and respect that this may not be the norm for them, that this may be out of their comfort zone, and you simply want to be thorough in your eye examination. Be respectful and effective in your communication. Anyone coming in for care will likely want the most accurate care. So in most circumstances, this communication from you may likely be enough for them to look at you and for you to complete your examination. Offer them a soft gaze rather than a stare. In North America, we are often used to directly and confidently looking at others in the eye, which can come across as harsh for patients who do not normally do this. Be cautious to never try to move someone's head or position themselves so that they have to look at you if they do not want to. Do not be hostile and do not use force. At all times, your patients need to feel comfortable and you need to provide your services within the parameters of their comfort. The last case we will be looking at is around accessibility and providing care. Two people walk into your optical dispensary. They're using sign language to communicate with one another. On behalf of the deaf patient, the individual accompanying them asks what kinds of frame styles are trending. Who do you respond to? And what are some examples of ways to ask a patient about their needs? Although some deaf people can speak and/or read lips to an extent, if their primary means of communication is sign language, you cannot rely on these methods of lip reading when discussing serious matters such as health. An interesting fact, only about 25% of English is visible on the lips. And if English is not someone's first language, this will be even less effective. Writing back and forth may be acceptable when making small talk, but not with giving information about a medical condition or a diagnosis. What then are some suggestions? When in the presence of a sign language interpreter, always look at the deaf person, not the interpreter, even when the deaf person is concentrating on the interpreter. Some deaf people may prefer to use technology to communicate, for example, a phone app that turns spoken English into the printed word. Another means of communication is video remote interpreting, VRI. VRI involves a computer screen and a camera that allows a person in a remote location to act as your interpreter. Have someone on your team who is a qualified sign language interpreter. On your website, you may even want to indicate that you encourage deaf patients to make an appointment if possible, rather than walking in, simply so that you can have your sign language interpreter available for them. At all times, remember that effective communication with your differently abled patients is worth every investment you can make. Finally, let us recap on a few DEI best practices that I hope you all will continue to practice. Firstly, prioritize diversity in every aspect of your practice. Ensure that your network is diverse. That network can include your colleagues, your patients, the community you practice within, and anyone else that influences you. If you work with others in your optical practice, prioritize diversity in building your team. Remember that people with other passions and identities will bring different perspectives as well as lived experiences and skills that will fill gaps you may not even have noticed. You are practicing in a province like Ontario, where your patients will be incredibly diverse in all senses of that definition. Ensure that your practice not only caters to them, but is rather truly inclusive of them. Next, I encourage you to learn by actually doing. Remember, success always involves failures. You won't always get it right, and that's okay. If you don't prepare for some mistakes, then you might get easily discouraged or even quit. Know that even those of us who are deeply committed to fostering a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment have our biases and can make false assumptions. Not every policy you create will work, especially the first time. Not every DEI program will have its intended results. Be flexible and adaptable. If something is not working, make the adjustments. And lastly, become committed and remain committed to being a lifetime advocate on DEI. When it comes to the cultural competency journey, you can never fully arrive. There is no final destination because diversity, equity, and inclusion will continuously evolve, and you will always find something different to learn or a new issue that must be addressed. Looking through a DEI lens, whether at your practice,